given that the Capitol Hill riots have been probably managed to beat even the election and COVID in terms of news coverage over a short period of time, what do you think people should have taken away from that?
That Trump was they thought Trump was the river, but he was the dam. They thought Trump was the source of all this kind of all the things that they hated, and that once you get, like, I used this metaphor before, he's like the head vampire. Once you get rid of the head vampire, all the other vampires dissolve, and you can return to what you perceive as normal. There's not going to be a return. The enemy class will never have this absolute power that they had before, even anywhere near it. Increasingly, people are becoming not just hostile to them, but how do you have a conversation with someone who doesn't just distrust you, but is completely uninterested in anything you have to say? I don't see how you can put that Humpty Dumpty back together again. And I think that is going to be, so their only metric is silence the opposition, right? Because basically, if you have two options and then I get rid of one, by default, everyone's going to go to me. Well, it's very hard to silence an entire population in a world where there's technology, entire internet based on allowing people the opportunity to speak and present their points of view. I don't see how it's done. And it's also, and the left historically has understood this, when you drive a population underground and they have nothing to lose, this is going to radicalize them and blow up in very dangerous ways. So I have thought for a long time what I would do if I were, the corporate press, to try to reintegrate this population society. And they're basically doing the complete opposite of what I would advise. And I'm not surprised, because if they're capable of learning, they wouldn't be the enemy class.
What would you advise? Let's say that Michael Malice gets put in charge of the media. How do you bring the disaffected groups back in?
I would have some sort of – it would be tough, because since I have for decades been – advocating for war, lying to a population, just brazenly, shamelessly go to their children, it's going to be really hard to get them back on board. But I would do things like I would take some sort of marginal figures and put them in some kind of ceremonial position and pretend, okay, we're going to make an effort to reintegrate. I would stop trying to I would have these places where people could have these discussions, but try to build as many moats around them as possible instead of trying to silence them completely. Let them talk to each other, but try to have that talking not reach the mainstream consensus. That's going to be hard. And I would stop trying to do things like, if you're sitting there talking about calls for vengeance and people can hear you, this is really going to give them an incentive to strike first, right? Because then it becomes self-defense. So all of Twitter was all about, we have to persecute these people. We have to drive Josh Hawley from the Senate, Ted Cruz from the Senate. We have to make sure this never happens again. It's like Trump's numbers went up in terms of the voting share from 2016. So you really have a problem if for 4 years of going after someone who is not particularly a good person or a nice person, and he had more people voting for him the second time around. Strategically, whatever approach you had did not work, because it did, even though he did lose the election, it did not decrease the number of people who are comfortable going in that ballot box and for whatever reason flicking that switch on his behalf.
Is that not the maddest thing, that the media, the legacy media, the left, everybody threw everything that they had at that election? Kitchen sink went, the cat went, the baby and the bathwater, and only just scraped through a Democratic victory.
Yeah, and they lost a significant number of seats in the House. Joe Biden is the last time the incoming president didn't have the Senate. He has a 51-50, but this is marginal. Was Richard Nixon. So that is not a governing consensus in the House. It's something like 219 to 212. These are, and because it's here in the States, each party is basically coalitions of different groups. 219 Democrats is not as cohesive and coherent as people think, because you're going to have different wings and they're going to have different perspectives. And it's going to be very, very hard to get that majority through, especially in the Senate, where one person and you're done. And every senator, of course, represents different states and has different egos. So it is amazing. And the articles are already written. if there had been any metric other than losing, of course, where Trump kind of went down, Trumpism has been repudiated. The American people have come to their senses. They were just champing at the bit. And yes, Biden won, and they tried to put that over, but it fell completely on deaf ears. And again, I don't know what they can do to get people listening to them again.
Naval Ravikant on Rogan said this quote, and he didn't cite where it's from, but it's the best thing that I've heard around this. And he said, the left won the culture war. Now they're just driving around shooting the survivors.
Yeah. I don't know that they won the culture war. They created culture historically.
Yeah. The right just didn't bother getting involved.
Right. And the thing is, there's an enormous asymmetry between right and left, because when there's left-wing like cultural violence, it's rioting. But when you have right-wing cultural violence, it gets really ugly really, really fast, because they're playing for keeps, and it's quick and it's very brutal. So I am desperately hoping it doesn't reach that point, and I don't see any mechanisms of it slowing down.
That's precisely what I've said for the last few months, this tit-for-tat mechanism. I do a thing to you, you do it back to me a little bit more, I do it back to you a little bit more, and it just escalates. And what have you got left? There's only two ways that things happen. It can either be dictatorial, top-down, or it can be emergent, bottom-up. The culture's not slowing down. We've got frictionless communication, which permit everyone to go from brain to fingertip or mouth to internet world with basically absolutely no restrictions at all. That on its own accounts for an awful lot of why we're seeing more vitriol online. Like, we're not built to have our thoughts be broadcast to the entire world. Like, you shouldn't do it. Think about 200 years ago. You'd get a quill out, a piece of paper, and maybe like a pigeon or a raven or something like that, and you would send it to the local battlements. Like, if you're going to say something, you better make sure that it actually is meaningful. You can't just, like, toilet tweet something that ends up going viral and getting you in loads of trouble.
Yeah. Is this about when you guys burned down the White House? Because we haven't forgotten about that.
I didn't know that Russia had a White House.
Yeah, it's the Crystal Palace, I think.
Yeah, it is.